Hello, everybody. I am Nichole, and together with my partner Illeona, we are going to talk about the normative architecture of reality towards an object-oriented ethics by Justin L. Harmon, which is his dissertation submitted at the University of Kentucky for his Doctor of Philosophy degree in 2006. So, we are going to talk about the first chapter, the introduction, what is living and what is dead in speculative relativism. So this dissertation is partly an effort to explain the interface of myth and philosophy. So myth indicates the self-concealing background from and against which every explicit presentation is deployed. And philosophy points to one singular opening of or space of access to truth. However, if unity of philosophy is maintained in the multiplicity of philosophies, then it is not identical to true. It is just considered as a contingent and historical expression of the true. And accordingly, the truth is and can be revealed non linguistically and by non human actants. So it means that it is possible for truth to be discovered not by language and the search of people. However, humans engage in post-humanist project where unweaving of myths about human uniqueness and privilege are opened up for questioning. Now, Harmon asks the normative question, which he labeled as being at the most abstract level. So basically, whence norms? Whence translation is from what place or source. So this adds up to from what source are the norms? So questions are from where does the ought issue and why ought we recognize it? So the attempt to answer this is leaning towards being intuitive among secular non-philosophers. So examples of the questions to understand this matter are why is it wrong to swindle Mrs. Swanson out of her social security check? So the answer is because she's the sort of being that demands not to be swindled. Another is why is it wrong to effectively poison a community's water supply in order to save roughly around $100 a year? So because a human community is the sort of being that demands not to be poisoned. So we see a pattern of responses that even in the absence of an ontotheological being or higher being, where we anchor our justification of morals, the normative still exercises itself. And next, the theological absolutism is encapsulated in the line, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. Harmon's realist view is in contrast with the theological absolutism view that the absence of a transcendental universal measure does not entail the absence of the measure. His is more anchored on if there's no God, then nothing is simply permitted. Thereafter, his metaethical stance is in between objective absolutism and subjective relativism. Both aim to close the space of questioning, especially subjective relativism. However, there is a struggle not to be inclined to doing things for the mere observance of certain rules, as much as we should not use ethics as instrumental technology for securing our interests. So, ethical systems such as Kantianism or utilitarianism are used to technologize ethics and provide direction and guidance from rationality or from innate hedonism of humans. With this, axiology or value theory answers the normative question while separating it from categories of our long-standing search for the real. Now, Harmon delved deeper on object-oriented ethics, which rejects the notion that objects are a part of humans, where objects are limited to being used by humans and that they can't exist independently of humans. So, it rejects the privilege of human existence over the existence of non-human objects. So, he also stated that my project is not to reduce human beings in the level of mere things. Rather, it is to elevate the plurality of supposed mere things to a level of dignity and considerability. So Harmon explains that with the place importance and view of objects as not just mere things, as well as rejecting the notion of humans as higher than non-human objects, OOE or object-oriented ethics is a strategy for thinking an ethics that is reducible to neither subjective values nor objective principles. So it basically ups the position of non-human objects into a level that is dignified enough. So in April 2007, these four philosophers had a talk in London, which was called the first speculative relativism event. So this term was coined by Bashir as he was also the one who organized the event. So these four philosophers, although they have differences in points, are unified as they face the so-called antagonist, which Meilasu identified as correlationism. So correlationism, according to Meilasu, is the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. Meanwhile, Harmon's take on this is that it is a philosophy which assumes that the human world gap is the privileged type of all rigorous philosophy. So, from these two, we can already note the differences among the philosophers and their perspectives. But we already have a peek that in the center of correlationism is the Kantian view that supposes that human finitude or having boundaries or limits constitutes both intelligibility of the world and insuperable limit to any transcendence of this intelligibility. So, in the introductory essay of the edited volume of the Speculative term, Bryant, Cernick, and Harmon wrote this line in the slides, which means that the anti-realist position actively limits the capacity of philosophy in our time. So, with this looming ecological catastrophe, what is needed, according to Harmon, is the recuperation of a non-dogmatic conception of the absolute. However, Melasu said, against dogmatism, it is important that we uphold the refusal of every metaphysical absolute, but against the recent violence of various fanaticisms, it is important that we rediscover in a thought modicum of absoluteness to counter the pretensions of those who would present themselves as its privileged trustees. So, in my own interpretation, of course, heavily bounded by being in a religion, I feel like he's saying that we do not have to convince ourselves to succumb to blind faith or fanaticism. But Milas who understands that the total rejection of the absolute opens the door for the worst forms of fanaticism. So with this, he claimed that it is possible to envisage an absolutizing thought that would not be absolutists. Somehow, this states that we have to strike a balance into rediscovering a desirable small amount of the absolute, but not subscribing to it wholly to prevent fanaticism. So, Melus's efforts to delineate a non-absolutist absolute led him to a mathematization of the real, where he referred to mathematical statements to address properties of physical objects. Thereafter, Harmon finds the Cartesian Lockean privileging of the quantitative over the qualitative unnecessary and troubling, as he agrees with Alfonso Linguis's statement that the qualitative features of a thing reveal its nature and reality more than do its quantitative features. So Harmon obviously ascribes the phenomenological grounds and explains that in qualitative approach, we can perceive the ways through our perception, knowledge, and understanding. Another theory was presented, which is the actor theory of Bruno Latour. This theory is a source of great inspiration for certain speculative realists, especially Harmon and Bryant, two of the authors in the introductory essay. So under this is the theory of irreductionism, where all entities are equally real insofar as they act on other entities. So this means na each entity, from germs to weather conditions to democracies, is an actor and it makes a difference to its network with other entities. So again, Harmon and Bryant find the theory attractive and they used it to develop the flat ontology. So this states naman that the efforts to reduce one level of reality to another invariably leaves residues of the reduced entity that are not fully translatable by the reduction. So this implication is rejected by Harmon as he does not agree that an entity is at all reducible to its effects on other entities. Grant, one of the philosophers, is also against this view of reductionism. So he claims that what phenomena are cannot be reduced to how they appear for any given apparatus of perception, technological or biological. So thereafter, flat ontology is also the neutralization of all metaphysical hierarchies. So Manuel de Landa argued that instead of hierarchies in ontological categories, an approach in terms of interacting parts and emergent wholes lead to flat ontology. This is explained by Harmon as every part is also a whole. There's no one given part or emergent whole that can claim ontological dominion over the others. And the emergence of self-presentation of new wholes is at once metaphysically and epistemically bottomless. So all these 3 points pertain to the neutralization of metaphysical hierarchies. But among the four philosophers, Harmon is the only object-oriented philosopher. So in 2010, he joined Bryant and two others in a first object-oriented philosophy symposium. So object-oriented ontology, or OOO, is a subfield of speculative relativism, which is a strategy to combat the sterility of correlationism. So according to Harmon, individual entities of various different scales are the ultimate stuff of the cosmos. So this claim somehow debunks the notion that humans are the only moral agents in the cosmos. Also, he argues that objects cannot be reduced to anything else but must be addressed by philosophy in their own terms. So this is in relation to flat ontology and reductionism. And then Harmon reveals two broad paths where post-Kantian philosophy reduced objects. Number one, undermining. Objects are undermined when they're reduced to deeper, more essential building blocks such as atoms, quarks, and monads. And then overmining occurs when objects are reduced to what they do, what they show, or how they appear, and what they're used for. And lastly, for my part, we have Harmon's system. And the concept under this is that every object which is irreducible and unified whole is ultimately a constellation of four elements. The first one is the real object, which is a unified autonomous whole, which exists as a physical entity in the world. And then we have real properties. So these are qualities that cannot be directly accessed, but without it, the real object will not be the same. And then we have the sensual object. So here, every phenomenon is perceived as a unified whole. So the object may or may not be presently visible. For example, you do not hear the crunching noise of the tires in the driveway as abstract sounds. Instead, you perceive it as your mom coming home from work. So that's an experience of the object through the use of your senses. Lastly, we have sensual properties. So this involves yung sound that you heard, the pain sa ears if it was too loud, ganon. So sensual object and properties are phenomenal, meaning they can be experienced sensuously by other objects. So now I'm gonna pass it on to Illeona for the second part of the report.
Okay, following Harmon's object-oriented ontology, essence basically means nothing more than the tension between a real object and its real properties in a single instant. It is not some timeless nature that an object possesses from the dawn of the world. Next, Jocson Harmon, or the author of this dissertation, discussed Harmon's object-oriented views, which he utilizes to build up his own position. First of which is ontological withdrawal, which is a center of Harmon's object-oriented position. Harmon's object-oriented position was discussed in several ways in his own works, but it turned out that this position of his is coming from his rather noble understanding of Heidegger's being and time. This view of Harmon was also referred to by Peter Wolfendale as Harmon's argument from excess. To further understand how Heidegger's being and time influence Harmon's object-oriented ontology, let us discuss the said reading. It is said that we try to understand the being of objects around us and how our understanding of the being of the objects around us are obscured by our interpretative tendencies or our efforts at thematizing. According to Heidegger, such entities are not objects for knowing the world theoretically. They are simply what gets used, what gets produced, and so forth. And we just need to consider them as they present themselves amidst our everyday lives in order to grasp the sort of being they have. These entities referred to by Heidegger as equipment or tools. In trying to understand the being of a tool, we usually go through a hermeneutic circuit, wherein we try to understand something as a part of a whole. In this case, we usually consider the end result of the task at hand where a tool was utilized in trying to understand the being of the said tool. However, the end result of the task at hand will only make sense if we understand or try to look at the object as a part of a whole. An example of which in the reading is a hammer. The use of a hammer will only make sense if you understand nails, boards, houses, and yeah. Furthermore, Harmon, according to Wolfendale, is also said to view excess as an essential, as he said that being excessive is an essential feature of entities, which according to Wolfendale converts the essential excess into an excessive essence. Moving on, in the first object-oriented ontology lecture held in Russia, Harmon stated that rather than overthrowing Kant in favor of some form of absolute knowledge, what we need is to spread the Kantian vision across the cosmos as a whole. For what Kant actually gave us was not a poignant theory of the special limitations of poor human beings. Instead, he gave us a nominal or phenomenal distinction that holds for all relation whatsoever. As he tries to unravel Kantian correlationist edict, which is grounded in an account of human finitude by extending finitude beyond the human, this is exclusive to Rasmus Hegel, a well-known Hegelian critic of the Dingenschik, which stated that the setting of a limit, the drawing of a line, does not in itself entail the postulate of knowledge about what is to be found on both sides of the line. In other words, there is a hidden contradiction in the Kantian setting of final limits within the realm of knowledge, because setting a limit between what we can know and what we cannot know necessarily entails some form of knowledge about what is at both ends of the limit. Thus, a human cannot establish the terms of the divide between knowing and not knowing a priori, without committing oneself to knowing more about what one does not know than one can ever hope to know about it, as we, as human beings, are always in a state of knowing and not knowing. Next is Harman's theory of vicarious causation, which basically states that while real objects never interact, their essential counterparts do. Moving on to Harman's second book, titled Real Metaphysics, Harman attacked relational metaphysical theories for being too reminiscent of a funhouse hall of mirrors. Using Alfred North Whitehead's position as an example, Harman mentioned that when we discuss volcanoes, there is some real entity out there in the world to which the name volcano refers. If we try to determine just what this volcano is for Whitehead, it turns out to be nothing more than his perception of other entities. These entities, in turn, are made of still further perceptions. Therefore, following Harman's position, every possible relational effect must always be some sort of nominal reality, thus every relational effect occurs indirectly. This conclusion of Harman was found to be disappointing because of its implication or lack thereof for ethics and political philosophy. As mentioned in the reading, how can one take an object which we typically call persons that constitute the social-political landscape seriously if these objects never touch, interact, or show themselves? And that it's not enough or sufficient to just point out that such interactions do take place, but at the phenomenal level of sexual objects and their properties because, and this must be kept in mind. Now, let us move on to the author's own position about objects in response to Heidegger's view on inflaming all entities purely as resources for human consumption. Harmon wanted to think of entities in general as subjects, as according to Harmon, there is always more to an object that can be encapsulated with ecological skins, that there is something in objects which we tend to resist or object to human appropriation. On the other hand, the metaphysical frameworks of Harmon, Melasou, Bryant, and other speculative realists has inspired Harmon on which direction his life of inquiry will pursue, including what will be and will not be included in his framework. In response to Melasou's metaphysical framework, which emphasizes being able to think prior to or independent of its givenness, Harmon said that we should think of being in contradistinction to givenness, which he has called self-presentation. Moreover, Descartes' view on being inert, value neutral, res extensa, over which as essentially evaluative beings simply lay our own privilege, meaning, and significance, made Harmon to define self-present as means to manifest as a bottomless series of directives in response to which other beings stand somewhere in the continuum of adequacy and inadequacy. To sum it up, for Harmon, objects are real just like for Harman. But unlike Harman, he is convinced that reality itself is phenomenal instead of an ineffable, vacuum-sealed, nominal core that withdraws from every relation. Harman defined real object as an excessively material and accessible plenum of demands that dictate the terms of an overwhelming, virtually infinite number of relations at multiple levels. And instead of being entirely non-relational, every relation in which a real object finds itself is both undetermined and undeterminate. Moving on to the next part of the reading, Harmon gave an overview of the following chapters of the whole dissertation. In chapter 2, Harmon focused on the distinction of the so-called is-ought or fact value. David Hume was the first to formulate the distinction explicitly in his treatise in Human Nature. On the other hand, Hume's guillotine, as described by Max Planck, dragged so hard and fast-stretched between descriptive and prescriptive propositions, which separated one from the other. This is the result of a contingent historical process beginning with the advent of modernity, the productive process of the Cartesian metaphysical subject. This chapter also discussed Descartes' metaphysical dualism and how its problematic substantialism was elevated by Hume, which paved the way for Kant's transcendental idealism. This chapter also tackled how human subjectivity as the absolute moral truth was established. In the following chapter, Harmon argued that to be or to exist means to be different, invoking Bryant's phrase to make a difference, which basically means to condition other objects of the plane of consistency. Harmon named this field of mutual conditionality the inter-object sphere. The inter-object sphere is where things happen, that is where the being of beings does its work. Following Heidegger's view, Harmon emphasized that being itself is not a being, but rather the self-presentation of this, or the determinate being. With this, Harmon also based the idea of being on the thing in Heidegger's Being and Time. Harmon also discussed in this chapter how major ethical frameworks like utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics try to innovate to make the lives of the privileged groups of human subjects easier. This in some cases somehow resulted in neglecting the rights not only of non-human objects such as animals and natural ecosystem, but also of certain groups of people, including women and non-whites. This chapter ended with John Locke Nancy's proposed ontologization of the ethical according to which being is being with, and being with is always a relation between irreducible singularities, and Harmon's view only differs in Nancy, where he extends ontological status of being singular, plural beyond the confines of the human to encompass all subjects. And lastly, the final chapter, Harmon discussed more concretely how objects are always in relation to the other objects, but in such a way that no kind of relation is ontological privilege. Objects on the inter-object sphere relate to each other interpretively, wherein interpretation means a state of being exposed or subjected to, but undermined by the demands presented by other objects or other beings. Harmon also tried to define the concept of interpretation using Luigi Parison's hermeneutic theory. Parison's hermeneutic theory views objects seriously as an inaccessible source of cues of directives that condition how the interpreter ought to respond to it or to take it up. Because every object is theoretically defined as an ongoing manifestation of ultimately irreducible and untranslatable demands, cues, or directives, interpretation constitutes an inescapable and essentially unfinishable task. It is also an essentially aesthetic task, since the interobject sphere is an interactive milieu where phenomena show themselves as something. Genuine interpretation aims at uncovering this as on the terms of the objects on ongoing self-presentation. Moreover, this chapter was oriented towards the problem of structural racism and police brutality in the United States, where Harmon discussed two common ways in which we tend to respond to the problem. First is the identification of subjective feeling and the view of from where no and the view from nowhere of objective statistical analysis. Harmon also discussed the major flaw in the essentialist discourse, wherein it is rather ontic than ontological.
So, we are going to talk about the first chapter, the introduction, what is living and what is dead in speculative relativism. So, this dissertation is partly an effort to explain the interface of myth and philosophy. So, myth indicates the self concealing background from and against which every explicit presentation is deployed, and philosophy points to one singular opening of or space of access to truth. However, if unity of philosophy is maintained in the multiplicity of philosophies, then it is not identical to true. It is just considered as a contingent and historical expression of the true. And accordingly, the truth is and can be revealed non-linguistically and by non-human actants. So it means that it is possible for truth to be discovered not by language and the search of people. However, humans engage in post-humanist project where unweaving of myths about human uniqueness and privilege are opened up for questioning.